George, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm thrilled to have the chance to talk to you in some depth about your new book, The Next Decade. I see that it represents a little bit of what's the right word, narrowing of the frame of ambition from your last book on the next 100 years. So you've now taken on perhaps the slightly more manageable next 10 years, or perhaps that's actually more unknowable, the next 10 years. So I think we can talk about that a little bit over the next hour, and some of your very counterintuitive views, I think, about what direction you see the world headed, and in particular, the U.S. encounters with that world, whether it's on Israel or China and your view of its rise, or Russia. I think you have some interesting things to say that are not exactly what you're going to pick up from reading the papers every day. So let's go ahead and jump right in to that conversation.
Please.
The next 10 years, what are the three most surprising takeaways that you are offering people in this book?
Well, I think the first is that the war on terror has been overdone, not in the sense that terrorism is not a profound danger, but as a monochromatic structure of a foreign policy. It simply is unsustainable. There are too many other things happening in the world. The second, I suppose, is a theme that we've been arguing a long time, which is that China has profound economic problems at this point. It's grown magnificently for 30 years. It will continue to grow, but it's going to go through an adjustment. But I suppose the most important thing that I'm arguing is that the next 10 years is really about the relationship between what I call empire and republic, between the vast global power of the United States, the difficulty in managing that and retaining Republican forms of government. I mean, Eisenhower obviously spoke about the political military, the military-industrial complex. I'm going beyond that. I'm saying that the requirements of managing an international system in which we are the only global power, with the institutions that we have, the complexity of our intelligence organizations, creates a situation where no one really has a clear idea what everyone is doing. Aside from creating unnecessary chaos in the world, it creates real challenges for the Republic. How do you maintain a democratic society in the face of this both accumulating and non-transparent power? So I would say those three things would be the most counterintuitive.
Well, that's right. You know, the word balancing, I think, is a word that appears a lot in the course of the book. And, you know, what you're talking about in many different areas of the world really is this question of what course is the U.S. going to chart? You know, are we going to adopt, for lack of a better word, a more realist approach to some of these challenges rather than the direct interventions that we've undertaken over the last decade? You point out, in fact, that the United States has been in war exactly 100% of the time of the 21st century, as opposed to the very, very bloody conflicts of the 20th century, which amounted to, I believe you said, 17% of the time. So are we going to find a way to back out of these wars?
We're going to have to find a way to back out of these wars without backing out of responsibility for the area. I say at one point in the book that the balance of power is to foreign policy what the Bill of Rights is to domestic policy. It is the founding principle of an empire. I'm not comparing the United States to these, but Germany, Nazi Germany, and Napoleon tried to rule by main force. It doesn't work very well. The Romans, the British, the Persians ruled subtly and indirectly, and by managing various players and controlling them and bringing them to the point where it wanted that.
Subtlety up till now has not been a hallmark of American diplomacy, however.
Well, we're a very young country, and it's only been 20 years since we've been the world's only global power. And I regard December 31st, 1991 as the break point in history. First, it was the first moment in which, in 500 years, in which there was no European global power. And second, it was the moment at which the United States, quite by surprise, I think was stunned that it happened, stood alone. And it takes time to build institutions. It takes time to build a political culture. It's not surprising that the first 10 years everybody's giddy and decided that history had ended and we were not going to have any wars. Then suddenly 9/11 happened, and it was all about the long war that would never end in the Islamic world. The United States is off balance. It didn't expect to be, and that's why I say this is the unintended empire. It didn't expect to be in this enormously powerful position. It doesn't really know how to manage it. And this is the decade, I mean, this is the third decade we're in since the fall, that it must come to terms with the incredible strains, not only it's creating in an international system, but also within the domestic system.
Well, that's right. I mean, in a way, I'm struck by your argument about the need for a new diplomacy and new institutions to go along with it that will be the agents of this sort of rebalancing. There's not really a clear sense that we are 2 decades into a project of building post-Cold War institutions. If anything, that project seems to have been put on hold or perhaps to have gone in the wrong direction by the reframing of American foreign policy as a global war on terror over the last decade.
And indeed, I think that that has to be adjusted. But let's remember that the British, as they started building their empire, were devastated in a 7-year counterinsurgency in North America, where they were badly defeated. The Germans in the 6th AD got their heads handed to them by the Germans. It's not uncommon for great imperial systems as they emerge, first to be totally unaware that they are an imperial system, and second to suffer serious reverses. We Americans, like others, tend to be operatic. As soon as we encounter a serious problem, we declare that we are failures, and this is a process we're going to go through. And the first step of the process, is sort of a 12-step process, I suppose, is admitting what we are. And for the United States, admitting that we're an empire is extraordinarily difficult. I mean, we are the first great anti-imperial project, the American Revolution. Right. We have been warned to avoid foreign entanglements. We have, as recently as World War II, argued that Europe is not our business. And there are a large number of people who feel that we should disengage.
Well, and again, that's something that hasn't gone away. That's not a historical
It's very real.
quaint artifact. That's going to be an increasingly live debate over the next 2 years.
But it's a debate. It's meaningless. You can't disengage.
Well,
the United States is 25% of the world's economy.
Right.
How do you disengage from the rest of the world where everything you do, unintended or intended, has devastating potential or great rewards for some region of the world? I mean, when we put quotas on a product, large numbers of people either celebrate or cry. And this is the problem. Our institutions are not really aware of the problems we cause at the decisions we make. The president's office is not always aware of what everyone is doing. And the public is unaware of how dependent they are on these relationships for their own well-being. So there is a lack of awareness, both in our institutions and our political culture, of the necessity of these relationships. But we'd like to imagine that we could have the benefits, but all of the nasty responsibilities will go away.
Well, increasingly, that's already the dialogue that you see taking place between the U.S. and China, for example, which is to say China is probably running through the end of its course of making the argument, hey, we're simply a developing country. We can't afford to bear the burdens of international leadership that the United States has been paying. The flip side is China wants to be recognized as the second largest economy in the world, growing towards being, at some point in the next couple decades, the largest economy in the world. At some point, those conversations are going to meet, and the question of who pays the bill for global leadership and what is required in order to sustain that is going to come up. But I want to back up. December 31st, 1991, you called the breakpoint in history. The collapse of the Soviet Union is what happened on that day, and the birth of the post-Soviet era, not only in American foreign policy, but in terms of literally rewriting the map of the world as we knew it. 2 decades later, we're gonna mark that anniversary this year. Things haven't necessarily turned out as some of the optimists would have had them. We have not seen a tidal wave of democracy and freedom wash across Central Asia and the Caucasus and Russia itself. Quite the contrary. In many ways, we've seen the resurgence of nationalism. We've seen new conflicts break out. We've seen really tempered expectations when it comes to what kind of political, economic, and social system is going to be existing across the space of the former Soviet Union. I want to walk through your map of the world 2 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You have some views that are that are very controversial, that are making some unexpected or perhaps predictions that some of our readers won't necessarily know what to make of.